Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Troutvetter. In this week's episode, London-based editor Charles Alcock talks about IATA's call for governments to better coordinate on COVID restrictions and safety precautions. Senior editor Curt Epstein covers Gulfstream's phase-out of the G550 production. Wichita-based editor Jerry Siebenmark provides an update on the Cessna Denali and its GE Catalyst engine. And senior editor Kerry Lynch discusses Aerion Supersonics' longer-term plans, as well as progress on its AS2 supersonic business jet and its GE Affinity engine. So Charlie, IATA had a press conference on Thursday, and they talked about governments getting their act together as far as air travel. So what do they have to say about that?
Well, really, their issue here is that individual governments, and they're mainly talking about Europe, this was kind of the European branch of IATA, they're saying, look, individual governments are making all sorts of plans about what travel restrictions there should be and in what circumstances flying should be able to happen. And they're really saying, look, for heaven's sake, it would be so much better if we had a coordinated response where we tried to do things consistently, because that way the airline industry would have kind of a sporting chance of actually getting things right, and things wouldn't just be changing the whole time in terms of what was required of them. And they pointed out that a couple of weeks ago, ICAO and IATA got together and actually published a pretty comprehensive set of guidelines of what would make sense in terms of safety measures and travel restrictions. And in fact, since then, EASA, the European regulator, and the European Center for Disease Control have adopted essentially their own version of that. And they're saying, this stuff's in place. Why can't we just do it? Why are we still standing around talking about it when we could be doing it? And what they mean is, coherent rules on which borders will be open to which group of passengers. Not every country gets to make up the rules every different week, depending on what their latest set of fears are.
So did they say anything about the financial impact of what's happening, and what happens if the restrictions are kind of scattershot?
Yeah, they were very, very blunt on this. And, IATA has given previous dire predictions about the state of the industry. Today, basically, they said, I'm sorry, folks, but it's even worse than we thought it was. Based on their latest projections, and again, mainly Europe now, they're saying that the consequences for the industry will be even more severe. They're talking about a combined loss for European airlines alone of just over $23 billion this year. They're now saying that even more jobs could be lost this year if nothing improves fairly soon. And really, they're starting to say, look, what the governments have done so far in terms of helping out with furloughs and so on is all well and good. But now we need these measures to be extended at least through the end of this year. So by that, they mean, for example, there's been a temporary easing of requirements to pay air traffic management fees, but those are going to come due in the next few weeks. About 2 billion euros in air traffic management fees are going to come due. And IATA is saying, look, the airlines just can't pay this. It's going to have to be deferred again. And then another big issue is that they want to extend the waiver on the slot allocation rules that require airlines to use these slots or lose them. And really, that's kind of absurd, because with current traffic levels, how can airlines conceivably use these slots in any sort of rational, cost-effective way? So they're saying those should be extended at least through the end of the next winter season. But we're starting to see some squabbles even within the industry, because the Airport Council International countered that demand over slots by saying, hey, you can't do that. The airports will go bust if you're just, going to be able to waive slots whenever it suits you at no notice. So, I suppose the overall picture here is things are about to get quite a bit worse if governments don't really step things up in terms of allowing a more coherent approach to this crisis.
Yeah, and IATA took more of a hands-off approach earlier in the week over COVID testing. And it ranges from some airlines only doing a temperature check to some actually drawing blood and running quick tests for COVID. And so, what did they have to say about that?
Yeah, well, this came up earlier, and it was IATA responding to suggestions by governments that the airlines should be responsible for actually testing passengers. And as you say, it's not what the government's apparently had in mind wasn't just a question of pointing a temperature camera at a passenger's head, as we've seen at Chinese airports. They were potentially talking about blood testing and various other types of testing. And IATA, I think, understandably saying, hold on a minute, you're basically asking the airlines to be running some sort of public health agency here. Even if passengers were willing to be subjected to that level of testing at the airport, that's just not going to be practical. And they did point out, actually, that with some of the tests that are proposed, there haven't necessarily been totally reliable results. So, they could be trying to test 300 or 400 people boarding a long-haul flight, and would it necessarily actually result in total certainty over the safety of all those passengers? Not necessarily.
Yeah, that would add a lot of time too, I would think, right?
It would, and I think what IATA are really saying in a sort of convoluted way is, look, we want to do the right thing for public safety. We want to introduce a set of coherent, achievable measures. But if we just keep on raising the bar and indeed moving the bar forward, we might as well give up. There never will be an airline recovery, because at some point people are going to have to say, okay, I will accept a certain amount of risk in travel. And in fairness to IATA, they're saying the guidelines that they and ICAO have recommended provide at least a reasonable degree of assurance that some effective measures are being taken.
Well, hopefully they can get through that and come to a resolution soon.
Absolutely.
So let's go over to Curt. Curt, this week Gulfstream announced that they're ending production of the Gulfstream G550 in 2021. That airplane has a long history, right?
That's right, Chad. So the G550, it traces its lineage all the way back to the company's very first business aircraft, the G1. And those aircraft all through the G1, G2, G3, G4, 450, G5, and all now to the G550, all share the same fuselage diameter. It's the same fuselage. The type certificates have been the same. And that is the end of an era down there in Savannah, because that represents the end of a direct link to the first airplane the company made.
So why are they deciding to end the production now? What's going on?
Well, obviously, last year the G600 entered service, which basically fills the same niche. And if you go down to Savannah, you see on the production line that it's much less labor intensive, much more automated. The production of the G600. The G600 is a much more advanced airplane. It's got much more newer features, newer avionics, newer everything. And Gulfstream said that basically this is it. We've sold the last of the G550s. It'll be delivered to a customer next year in 2021. Mark Burns noted that the airplane, when it came out, its design team won the 2003 Collier Award for its innovations. But that's the end of the road for this one, apparently. And the company says it will still continue full support of it in terms of parts and service. So that's just the changing of the guard there over at Gulfstream.
Yeah, it certainly is. It also has some special mission applications too, right?
Yes, there's a number of governments and military units in the world that are operating the aircraft. It's got various functions that make it very, very attractive for those missions. Extreme long range, a large cabin, high altitude capabilities. So yes, there are some applications of that. It's not certain whether those will continue, but I don't imagine that we'll be seeing any more of the commercial ones after 2021's last delivery.
Okay, thank you, Curt. On another aircraft program, Textron is going forward with its Denali single-engine turboprop, and you heard some news about that, right, Jerry?
Yeah, if you recall, Chad, it was last October since we've heard anything about Textron's new Cessna turboprop single offering, the Denali, What I'm hearing is what I understand from GE Aviation is They say they're still on track for delivery of the first Denali engine to Textron Aviation this year, as well as actually testing it on a King Air 350. If you recall, last October at NBAA, GE discussed, the engine's already been delayed. The engine's been delayed, so the entire program's been delayed. And if you recall, GE Aviation last October sort of laid out, well, this is the reason why. One was one of the reasons they cited was it's much more the certification process is much more intensive for a turboprop engine, and they were having some challenges with mounting the Denali or the Catalyst engine prototype to the flying test bed.
This is kind of unusual for Cessna. Usually they, historically, they've gone to the cutting edge of technology and then taking one step back in their aircraft. So that would mean, a new engine like this, and previously wouldn't be used in one of their new aircraft. They would go with an engine that was already certified. Is that a problem for them? Obviously we're seeing delays, so that delays the program too, right?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think they were looking for. I think at the time they announced the airplane, they were looking for a turboprop with FADEC, and they felt like the clean sheet catalyst that GE Aviation was proposing was the best fit for the airplane.
They also chose a clean sheet engine for the now canceled Hemisphere, and that was a problem for them. But it doesn't seem like that this is going to be canceled. It just seems like it's maybe a minor bump in the road. GE's a good company, and they seem like they're on top of it, right?
GE's done on the Catalyst. It's done more than 1,800 hours of testing on the engine, and that includes achieving 41,000 feet in an altitude chamber, as well as other development testing such as endurance, vibration, durability, ingestion, and integrated prop controls.
Have they talked about certification timeline for either the engine or the airplane? And how is COVID affecting all of that too?
Well, that's the thing, right? COVID is sort of what GE's saying. This whole COVID thing's really thrown a wrench into the timeline, and that's also the reason that Textron Aviation gives as for not naming when they expect first flight of the Denali. So the pandemic has certainly played a role in this. Obviously, GE, we've written a lot in the recent past about the thousands of furloughs and the thousands of layoffs that GE has made here in recent months, largely, from the commercial side of the business, but some of that has sort of spilled over to the business and general aviation side of their operations as well.
Okay. Thanks, Jerry. Actually, there's another aircraft program that's progressing as well. And Kerry, you listened to a webinar this week where Tom Weiss from Aerion Supersonic talked about the AS2 program and some other things they're doing. And also somebody from GE also talked about the Affinity engine for the AS2 during the same webinar. So what did you find out? What's going on with the AS2? What other plans does Aerion have?
Well, it's really interesting, Chad, because so much focus has been on the AS2, but Aerion really has a long-range, 30-year view of where it's going and how it wants to get there. And the AS2 is considering its starting point. They're looking at a much larger AS3. Now, they didn't discuss it, but they showed an overlap of it. And actually, the AS2 looked dwarfed on top of the AS3. So I assume that's their commercial variant. And, there's been some discussion in recent months about them looking at military applications as well. But beyond that, they're talking about, a holistic approach. They're looking at engine technologies or power technologies, if you will. They want to move towards all electric and maybe go from, working on sustainable fuel to hybrid, then to all electric. And they're also looking at even pushing the envelope much, much faster than the Mach 1.4 that the AS2 is at, and eventually get to hypersonics. And Tom Weiss said that they think that's doable. They're solving problems right up to the edge of hypersonics at like Mach 4, 4.5. But these are long range goals. The other thing they're doing, when I say holistic, they're looking door to door. Their vision is one day that you can walk out your door and get anywhere in the world on a major city to another place within 3 hours. Now, you would need hypersonic capability to get there, but there are other factors involved, such as getting to the airport. So now they're eyeing the eVTOL market, how you can partner with that to get to the airport and just make your travel experience seamless.
Interesting. And also, speaking of sustainability, the GE Affinity engine is probably the first engine that is being designed to run on 100% biofuel. So what did GE say about the engine? Where's the design? And how can they get away with running on 100% biofuel when everybody else has to use a blend because of the aromatics that are needed for the seals in the engine?
Well, they think they've made significant progress in the areas of getting past that need for the aromatics through new technologies and designs. Now, they're not going to be specific to that, Chad, at this point, but Joel Kirk, who spoke on behalf of GE Aviation at this AIAA Aviation Forum yesterday, said that they've been looking at everything from combustion to how in the byproducts in the turbine to even how the fuel system is tied in and how the whole engine interacts with the nacelle and how the nacelle interacts and the engine interacts with the airplane. So they're looking at it from every step. They said that he said they've done a lot of work around the biofuel aspect, and they believe they've gotten to the point where the engine can, quote, entertain both Jet A and sustainable fuels. He said that the technology is developed and matured to the point where they're in a good position to introduce it. Again, he wasn't real specific with that, but he just pointed to looking at new materials and new technologies that they're able to introduce because it is a newer engine design. And this isn't stuff, he said, you can really retrofit in past engines, but it works going forward. And I know that's not a very detailed answer, but that's, as much as I think at this point they're going to do. But the important message in all of this, I think, is that they're figuring out a way to crack that nut. They're also looking at, landing and takeoff. That's very important, the emissions and the noise. And they've already done baseline testing of exhaust and different elements that would play into that. Fixing these issues, takeoff, landing, noise, emissions, biofuel, I think is pretty critical to the success of the AS2, because if they can't solve these, then they can't convince regulators to allow this aircraft to move forward, because the environmental considerations are the single biggest barrier to supersonic flight.
Yeah, actually, that's a good segue into getting back to Aerion. What do they say about the COVID right now? They seem to indicate that there's a delay in the AS2 program. And what about funding? Because Boeing's one of their Boeing has made a big investment in Aerion, and Boeing is not doing that great right now financially in the COVID crisis, right?
Well, there's absolutely funding, or there's absolutely a delay right now. Aerion said that they did have to lay off some workers or reposition workers, if you will. They didn't use the term layoff, so I don't know if it's furloughs or whatever they had to do. They had to slow it down a little bit because of COVID. But they're talking about ramping up hiring at the end of the year or the beginning of next year and looking at a host of engineers. Now, Aerion has always been fairly circumspect about funding, except to say they have it. They do have some pretty important partnerships with companies such as Boeing, and they maintain those partnerships are going. But I mean, rationally, Boeing, is having its own issues. So you would think that there would be a pulling back or a slowing systemically. But they said those partnerships are absolutely still in place. As far as Aerion goes and the funding goes, they do have a very strong order backlog that may help attract investors. They gave some numbers this week saying that their firm order backlog is beyond $3 billion, and they're in talks for another $6+ billion more, and they see a $40 billion market for the AS2. So they've got some pretty strong numbers that they're trying to take to the market, and they're also, investing in that brand new facility, which in Melbourne, Florida, and they're designing it from the ground up, and so that's going to require a great deal of investment. So it'll be interesting to see how this progresses as time goes on.
So what's the timeline for the AS2 now? And did they discuss, what kind of customers they expect? I know there's fractional orders, but how else do they expect this aircraft to be used, by customer type?
The timeline has been pushed back just a little bit. And they are now saying PDR, preliminary design review, is likely to occur in 2021. I think they wanted it as soon as this year, especially with the redesign, but I think it's going to be a little later. And then first flight would follow in 2025 with entry into service in 2027. Now, when I spoke to them just a couple months ago, they were talking first flight around 2024. So it might be as much as a year pushback, or maybe, months within a year pushback. But when you look at a program that has been ongoing for well over a decade, which has had soft deadlines, I'm not sure that that's a huge delay.
And what would they say about customers? Who are their prospects?
Well, as we all know, FlexJet is their launch customer and their largest customer, but they said all fractionals, and actually they're targeting all companies, whether it's fractional or charter, that really have high-end services for customers. And some of the ones they mentioned was obviously FlexJet, but NetJets and VistaJets, and interestingly, Wheels Up. They're also looking, of course, at high net worth individuals. That's always a target audience. And they mentioned the potential of corporate flight departments. However, interestingly, Tom Weiss expressed the view that a lot of corporate flight departments are getting away from whole ownership and getting into programs such as charter membership programs or fractional. So, they could potentially attract corporate flight departments even through their sales to FlexJet.
Interesting. All right. Thanks, Kerry. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.